Today is our very first version of our Becoming series, so there will be a lot more of these to come. So if you're here for the very first one, you get to see how things are going and get things started on the right foot. So thank you everybody for joining, either after a long day of work or school or parenting or hiking, whatever you had going on today. It's great to have everybody here at the end of the day. And so just so you know, our Becoming series is going to be once a month, and our goal is to host career leaders in energy efficiency so that they can share their stories. And the event today is going to run for 45 minutes sharp, so we're trying to have a cutoff at 5:45 Eastern Time. Our first half is going to be our speaker, Jérôme, sharing his story, and then we're going to welcome questions from the audience. I'll go over this again at the end, but for questions, I ask that you either use the Q&A box, or you can ask me to unmute you, and you can ask your questions right to Jérôme yourself. No need to be shy, he's super friendly. And please note that we will be recording the session, so I will be hitting record in just a second, so just so you're aware of that. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our speaker before he gets started. Jérôme Bilodeau is Chief of Policy in the Buildings and Industry Division of Canada's Office of Energy Efficiency, and he teaches energy efficiency policy at Carleton University in Ottawa. Prior to joining the Office of Energy Efficiency, he was a senior consultant at Dunsky Energy Consulting and head of GHG policy development and analysis within Environment and Climate Change Canada's Energy and Transportation Directorate. A very short title. He sits on the board of the Canadian International Council's National Capital Branch and was a board member of the Canadian Coalition for Green Finance. So super interesting background, lots of experience to share. And so without further ado, Jérôme, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thanks, Kirsten. Very happy to be here today and very happy to be the first person to kick off this wonderful series, Becoming with Efficiency Canada. I'm looking forward to this presentation and the questions today, and I'm looking forward as well to the future presentations of this series. So as she said, my name is Jérôme Bilodeau, and I currently work at the Office of Energy Efficiency in Ottawa, and I'm the first person to present. So what I will do today is I will walk you through, I have a few slides here to help myself because I can't see you, so I need to look at something. So I will walk you through 4 general areas that I wanted to discuss over about 20 minutes, and then we'll go through a series of Q&As, and I'm happy to answer whatever question you have. My email address is at the end of this presentation. I'll be happy as well to answer any questions if you have them after this 45 minutes. So since I'm the first one, I do want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about the energy efficiency sector as a whole before to situate myself a little bit and just a variety of jobs that are in this particular sector, an emerging sector as well, or growing sector rather. Then I'll talk a little bit about my roles plural, because I do play a couple of roles in energy efficiency, and I've had a couple of roles in this particular field, so I'm happy to answer questions on that. Then I'll talk about my background, so essentially how did I get there, and how could you get there as well, if that's something that you're interested in. And I'll end with a few tips. So I was asked to answer a few basic questions, I would say, that you may have about this field. Now, my understanding is that people here, a lot of them are university students or people fresh out of university. So I am tailoring that presentation roughly in that direction, but I think it also applies to people who are looking to get into this particular area. So just to start, so energy efficiency is such a big place. And of course, I'm going to start with a graph for those who know me. I just wanted to take a quick moment to reflect on how big of a sector this is. In 2018, there were 436,000 employees in Canada in this sector. So many people that are trying to make our energy more efficient. So using less energy to get the same kind of service. And so there's a lot of people in there. So there's many categories here. I would say there's 2 major categories. There's the people who go and physically do it. So that's people in construction, people in manufacturing, people who are trading and selling those energy efficient equipment and services. And then there's the people who are also trying to make sure that we go and do it. So there's people who are in utilities, people who are in governments, people who are in all the professional services that surround all of this. And all these people, such as myself, they exist because energy efficiency does not happen on its own. It needs a bit of a needs a bit of a push, a bit of a nudge. So in this group, so the top there, the professional, business services, utilities, other services, so the people who are trying to get us to do more energy efficiency, there's quite a bit. So I just wanted to flag a little bit here. So when we talk about policies and programs, we're talking about organizations and people that are trying to make our systems more efficient and make people's energy more efficient through various ways. It can be anything from codes, building codes, regulations and standards, tax measures. It can be incentive programs, giving people money so that they can buy something a bit more efficient. It can be financing, loans from banks. It can be putting a label on your equipment or on your house. All these little aspects that are, all these elements that are making our energy, our equipment, our homes, our buildings a little bit more efficient. And there's a lot of people who are trying to do this through various means. So there's people who work in governments at all levels. So federal, provincial, municipal, and others really. Everybody is involved in this. It is shared jurisdiction. There's the people who run programs. So program administrators, they have various names, various forms in different places. This includes your utilities, electric utilities, gas utilities. It can include efficiency organizations specifically. If you're in Nova Scotia, you might know about Efficiency Nova Scotia, Efficiency Manitoba, and other organizations of that sort. There are think tanks, associations, nonprofits, Efficiency Canada is one of them, that are giving us a lot of ideas, a lot to think about, frameworks, suggestions, recommendations as to how and what we should be doing. There's people in finance that are trying to put money behind this and make money as well because it is profitable or it can be profitable. And then there's consulting firms as well that are helping everybody in terms of providing strategic advice, technical analysis, and other services as well, program design and so on. And there's many more, but just to say there's a whole lot of organizations that are trying to do all of those things on the left and more to get us to be a bit more efficient in the way we use energy. So I fit currently in government, so in the federal family, top left there. And there are tens of thousands of us in this particular area and a lot more, of course, in the broader sector. So who am I? What do I do? I've had, I would say, 3 major roles in the energy efficiency sector related to policy and programs more broadly. So I'm currently the Chief of Policy in the Buildings and Industry Division at the Federal Office of Energy Efficiency. I also teach a master's course at Carleton University called Energy Efficiency Policy. Prior to that, as Kristen mentioned, I was also a consultant at a firm called Dunsky Energy Consulting that helps governments, utilities, and other organizations with their clean energy programs and policies. So 3 roles. Today we'll talk about my role on the far left here, so Chief of Policy in the federal family. I'm happy to field questions on the other roles as well, and I will mention a little bit as well what I'm doing at Carleton University if you're curious about that. But I'm here to talk about policy. So my role. So I will say policy takes various shapes, various forms, there are different things that you do, but there are some major responsibilities that are, I would say, common across this area. So in my current role, I'm responsible for a number of things. So program design and development. So if the federal government wants to design new programs in the context of energy efficiency in buildings or in industry, that falls on me and on my team. If the government is looking for policy analysis and advice, strategic policy analysis and advice on energy efficiency matters for various reasons, for trying to figure out which programs to move forward, which programs to change, which policies to enact, where do we go with a given regulation, with a given code, all these kinds of things. Myself and my team are involved in that. Key responsibilities also include stakeholder engagement, which is a really nice word for meeting people. So lots of time talking to people in this enormous ecosystem that I mentioned earlier. So the federal government is just one player among so many in this energy efficiency field. And the best way to have the the way to have the best impact is if we all work together and coordinate our efforts accordingly based on the levers that we have constitutionally, based on the funding that we have, based on our capacities, and so on. So a lot of time is spent also working with different organizations, trying to understand how we can design the best policies and programs that make sense for Canadians. And lastly, in my case, of course, team management. So I do manage a team of analysts that are responsible for really doing a ton of that work behind the scenes and on the stage as well. So those are the broad responsibilities, and a little bit later on, I will run you through perhaps a day in my position or particular topic and what that looks like. But those are the kinds of things that you're responsible for when you're working on that particular field of policy and programs, I would say, in energy efficiency. Now, what kind of skills are required to do this kind of work? And there's no particular order in what I wrote here, but I think they're all, I would say they're all quite equally important. Communication is a critical skill, of course. So writing and speaking, you need to be able to convey your ideas properly in order to give proper advice and to help others, to persuade others to go in a certain direction as well. So communication is really important. The second one is analytical skills. So I put both qualitative and quantitative. So you do need to spend a fair amount of time with spreadsheets as well as reading reports and other qualitative research because you spend a whole lot of your time writing reports, writing presentations, working on spreadsheets and doing all of that kind of work. So you need to be able to have that analytical eye to what you do. Then I wrote structured and strategic thinking. So if you're working in policy and program development, if you're trying to figure out what is it that needs to happen to get us to adopt more energy efficient measures or practices, it's a big question and there's a lot of moving pieces and it's easy to lose track or to not have your eye on the ball. So you need to be able to think strategically and you need to be relatively structured and organized in the way you look at things so that you can then convey that to another person as well. Other skills, of course, project and team management. There's a lot of project management because there's a lot of different projects happening at the same time with different deliverables, different timelines, and whether you're in, I would say when I was in consulting, deadlines are of course constant. It's the same thing I would say in the public sector as well. If you have a specific deadline to meet, for instance, a Treasury Board requirement where they're going to say yes or no in a particular budget request, you have to be able to manage all of that and to manage a big team behind it as well. And the last skill I would say is research, because you will spend a lot of time looking at trying to get information from other sources as well. So I hope this gives a general sense of what it is that I do. So I'm responsible for the policy aspect from the buildings and industry side of things. So anything except a house. So commercial, industrial falls in my jurisdiction, so to speak. So if I spend a bit of time, so what is a day in my life? And of course, it's a bit hard to pick one day. No day is exactly the same. I did write a few things. First, I thought I was going to tell you about my day today, and then I lost control of the day, as so often happens, and it's not the best example. But I will give you maybe a bit of a composite day that can make sense. So one day might mean spending an hour participating at a conference or an event, for instance. So today, actually, I was participating in an event on industrial energy efficiency with international partners on a very specific topic here of energy management systems. So trying to figure out what others are doing and how we can do better as well here. It can mean as well working on a number of documents, and I'm giving this as a broad description, but you know, Word documents, PowerPoints, Excels, that do a number of things. So for instance, it can mean working on a budget proposal, or it can mean working on a new policy proposal or program proposal if you want to to design or implement a new program or a new policy in government. And there's a lot of different things that go into this. It can mean conducting research and preparing presentations, writing policy briefs, writing different notes to design new programs, for instance, for commercial building retrofit. So we're trying to retrofit more commercial buildings in Canada because for various reasons, right? Climate change and job creation and so on. And we're trying to design this new program. Well, there's a lot of work that goes behind all of that, quantitative, qualitative. It can mean doing what I'm doing now and in a slightly different way and briefing a minister or a deputy minister or someone senior to help them make a decision on the path forward with respect to energy efficiency. It can mean consulting with stakeholders in a given day or having a meeting with someone, preparing presentations that go along with that. It can mean meeting with them to understand where they're going and so on. It can mean spending time as well doing some spreadsheet analysis on how much are we going to save from this new program in terms of gigajoules, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. So there's a lot of these different things. So if I were to put it in terms of the function, you will notice that there's a lot of document writing, there's a lot of meeting people, there's a lot of briefing people, there's a lot of presenting. So it is an office job in that context. So if you're looking for the kind of work where you're outside or where you use your hands for things other than your keyboard and your mouse, this is not, of course, the kind of work that will fit your particular background, but that's roughly what we're talking about here. Now, this is me. I do have a team. So just to give you an example, today, and that is true. So today, one person was working on drafting a strategy related to a particular topic. In this case, it's building commissioning. I had one person, so this is a strategy that's part of the government's policy or program. There's one that was working on putting the final touches on an agreement with the US government to adapt some of their tools for the Canadian context. There was one person who was working on an implementation plan for an upcoming initiative. There was one person who was doing research and drafting a report on a topic where the government is not quite there yet and might want to do more work in. There was one person who was working on a quantitative methodology related to how we report our energy efficiency savings and other things of that respect in our programming. So there's a whole lot, there's a whole suite. I hope that gives you a bit of a sense of things. So that's the by time really in a day. I put here on the right by topic. And the reason I wanted to mention this is just to put this back into this initial discussion at the beginning to show how policy is not just done in my team, in my office, of course. It's done in so many different places. And in the political side of things, in the bureaucratic side of things, and consulting, and think tanks, and utilities, so many different people are involved. And so in one particular topic, you might have all of these people working together. So if you're talking about, let's say, you want to improve the rate of commercial building retrofits, and what might happen in the government is you have someone in government who will say, well, we need to increase that rate. Here's a particular policy that might make sense. Here's what we heard from think tanks. Here's what we're hearing from stakeholders. But we need a little bit more information. We're not sure exactly how this should be done. So perhaps we hire a consulting firm that will help do a bit of market research and provide some recommendations. Meanwhile, the government will work with different colleagues at different levels, trying to look at, well, what are the different levers? What's the best way to go about doing this? Then you get a presentation, from various people, whether they're in consulting, they're in a think tank, and so on. You get that information, you take it together, you design something, you put it forward through a process to get it approved, and then to go and design and implement it. So there's a whole lot going on in this one particular topic, and you're never alone. It's always a big ecosystem. Conversely, when I worked in the consulting side of things, it's, you may be requested to do a particular project where you have to do some technical analysis, some market research. You might need to provide some policy recommendations for an organization. And so you do that work, you write in a report, and you send it out. So policy programs is really all of those things. It's a lot, and hopefully that is clear enough, and I'll be happy to answer questions. It's not the easiest thing to explain, I think. So that's roughly my role. I didn't mention the teaching, but I'm sure you're very well aware of that, what that entails. In terms of my background, so how did I get to do this kind of thing? So my education is, I'm an engineer, and I did an MBA as well. So you will find in energy efficiency in general, not just policy and programs, but in general, there's a huge diversity of educational backgrounds. So I'm an engineer, I've done business as well. There are a lot of engineers for sure in energy efficiency, as you can imagine, but there's a ton of people in other sectors as well. So people I've seen a lot of people with similar roles as mine, public, private, working with backgrounds in economics, in business, science, public admin, political science, and many others. I've seen people who have none of those backgrounds and are absolutely, they're superstars in the country. So I will say, of course, if you have the skills that I highlighted earlier, your educational background is, it's important, but it is not, I would say, critical. There are many ways to get into this particular line of work. And just to give you, of course, look at my particular case, the chief of policy in my particular unit I'm an engineer. So it is not necessarily someone who studied policy. So that's my background. Now, that's educational background. Before this, what did I do? So I started out, of course, as an engineer. So I did a lot of very technical engineering work in R&D, always in energy. So I was always involved in energy, and that was I won't say a fluke, but it's just I fell into energy. It was not energy efficiency though. So I spent most of my initial years working either in mostly on the supply side of things. So I worked in power plant research, I worked in biofuel combustion research, that kind of stuff, very technical. I did that in Canada. I did some an internship in Germany, for instance. So I was always involved in energy in that particular side of things. Then I had some engineering roles as well, more in terms of very technical stuff in standards development and methodology. So a lot of very technical things. So, trying to understand how to test your air conditioner so that we can determine whether it used a lot of energy or not. How do we regulate coal-fired power plants, that kind of thing. So a lot, still very technical. But I would say that my interest, I always had a bit of an interest in more strategic thinking as well. So I did move a little bit away from those engineering roles. And I took a role in consultant first at Dunsky in Montreal, wonderful firm, doing really, really wonderful work. And that was a role very much involved in energy efficiency program and policy work, as well as other aspects. So mobility, clean energy. So that's my particular background. I am very well aware that a lot of that is a bit of luck. I had a co-op program at university that allowed me to have good experiences. I fell into energy specifically without knowing much about energy efficiency, and eventually that led me in that particular direction. But I would say that a lot of the people I spoke to, and I know in this particular field, very few, if any, start with the idea that I want to be an energy efficiency professional. That was not, at least when I started, a big topic of discussion among my peers at the very least. A lot of people will have a similar story where they fell into it in one way or another. So I'm sure we'll have a lot of really great stories in this particular Becoming series on that. And of course, there's a whole lot of just luck of being in that particular field, as I mentioned. I will say that all my roles, and I'll talk about some tips in the next and final slide, but I applied to all of my roles, except in recent years where there's been a bit more, it's a bit more headhunting and poaching of that nature. But in general, I will say, if you're trying to get into this field, you will have to apply, and there's going to be a lot of jobs that are posted, and you will see them on LinkedIn. You'll see them perhaps in other areas as well. But in general, my path was pretty linear in that fashion. So my last element was some tips, and I broke it down in 5 areas here. So skills to cultivate, experiences to gain, people to know, attitudes to embrace, and knowledge to seek. And truth is, I didn't actually prepare anything. I thought I would just speak from off the cuff here as to what springs to mind. In my particular case, I will say skills to cultivate. And I do say this to a lot of people. I've had to hire many people in recent years. I've been on many hiring boards. I've seen it public, private. I've worked with a lot of students as well in my academic work. I will say that in the policy side of things, policy and program, but policy in general, the skills to cultivate are joint. There's 2 sides of things, and I mentioned some earlier, but one is you need to be able, if you're someone who's very technical, you need to work on the communication side of things. And if you're someone who is very good at the more qualitative side of things, you need to work on quantitative. Because I've seen that people who do best, in my experience, are people who can at least speak both languages. And I don't mean being an expert in either way, but it's important, I think, to have a decent feel for both sides of things. And part of the reasons is, going back to that first slide, is this is such a diverse field that the people you're going to encounter in this field are also diverse in their backgrounds. So you're going to be speaking with a lot of engineers and a lot of economists and a lot of public servants or utility workers. And it's a very broad swath of people. So you do need to have a good sense of their language. So if you're afraid of spreadsheets, you might want to spend a bit of time on that. And if you're not used to writing in a particular succinct way or more high-level way, you may want to develop those kinds of skills. Number 1. Number 2, in terms of experiences to gain, it's easy for me to say, you need to gain those kinds of experiences. This is what led me to that point. I don't think there's any one path. And so I think that's the one thing I will say. But one aspect I will mention is a lot of energy is in a lot of different kinds of organizations that you might not have thought about working for before. So, if you're in Saskatchewan, you might not think about working for a, Sask Power or electric utility. You might not think about working for, this think tank that talks about promoting, sustainable energy and so on. There's a lot of different areas where you can come about this particular field, and I would say that's probably a good place to start. If you're specifically looking to work on policy work, I will say that you should be involved closer to various levels of government and public organizations, as well as the organizations that support them. But in general, I think there's various different ways to go about this. And I will say one thing is that the experiences that are sought in the policy sphere I've seen are people who have seen the industry closely as well. So I think there's a lot of variety in what you can achieve. That said, if you're a university student, I would recommend trying to get internships. That's been very helpful in my particular case, at least. People to know. I don't have names, of course, and I won't give names. And it's more the idea that, of course, applying to jobs is going to be important, but having a good network of people is key as well. So just make sure that if you're looking for work, talk to everybody that you know. Last 2 items, and I'm looking at the time, I realize I spoke a little bit longer than I hoped. Attitudes to embrace. I will say the one thing is don't be afraid to apply to a position, even though you may not think that you're qualified. You never know where that's going to go. And I'll give you 2 examples. I pitched the idea of my course to Carleton University. It's not something that I applied for. I gave them the idea, or at least I pitched the idea. And there was a different course before as well, I learned. But if you go outside and you say, hey, I'm trying to do this, something might happen. It might not, but it might. In my life, that's happened twice. The second time was I applied in a position that I was not fully qualified for. And the firm said, you're not qualified for this yet, but we think you're qualified for this other role. Why don't you try that? And that worked out great. So don't be afraid to try, is what I'm saying, and don't sell yourself short. And the last element, knowledge to seek. It is a field with a lot of different areas to look into. I do recommend that you know your stuff. So if you're interested in that kind of work, do read reports from the large organizations that are in this field. Efficiency Canada, of course, various levels of government and consulting, International Energy Agency, all those kinds of groups produce a lot of material that I suggest you at least read the executive summary of to be relatively familiar. There's a lot of material as well with, in podcasts and various different formats. So I do suggest that you put in a bit of that work and become a little bit of a nerd in this area if you want to impress. So I will stop here. Spoke a little bit longer, but hopefully we have plenty of time for questions as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Jerome, for an awesome presentation. As someone who finds policy a little bit daunting myself, I have a lot of respect for what you do. So I will now be moderating some questions from the audience. So just to reiterate, I'll be focusing on questions that are submitted through the Q&A box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. If you submit them through the chat, I might get to them, I might not, but your best bet is to go through the Q&A box or raise your hand to ask a question there. And our only request is that there are no sales pitches. So just focusing on Jerome and his experience and what he can share with the audience. So we have a question here from Naveed. How would you describe your transition from private consultancy work to policy and government?
Right, so that's a great question. And I will say that I had worked in government before, although not in policy, in a very technical role. So I had a decent sense of what government was like. I will say that it is very different when you're in a technical role versus when you're more in the policy and the more decision-making process as well. So they're very different in many ways. They're working in the same area, but they're very different in terms of the pace or the types, the size of the organizations, perhaps, depending where you are, the nature of the work as well. So I would say there is a bit of a transition either way, whether you're from government to private, private to government. So there's a bit of an adjustment, I will say. But I think, if you're flexible, I think you learn quickly to adapt to the new environment. One area that I would say is a little bit different is if you're in the public policy aspect of things, you are responsible for, you're accountable and responsible for implementing certain areas of the government's agenda. So there are specific elements that you have to take into account that you might not if you're in a private capacity. But in general, I think it's a transition that many people have made well. But I will say that there's different personalities that fit better in one place or another, and it's hard to know until you try. I love consulting. I enjoy what I'm doing in government as well. There's a lot of different aspects to this.
Awesome, thank you. This one's a little bit related. I think you could answer it about consulting or even about your work now. To what degree of flexibility does an analyst have in opting for working on a project of their choice? And additionally, how does a project originate? So 2 questions in one.
That's a great question. I will say there's only so much flexibility. There is some flexibility, but at the end of the day, in my current role, you have to either implement or advise on for the government of the day. So that is the role if you're in the public side of things. That said, at the end, a lot of organizations, they're looking to move the needle, to make things better. And how do you do that? They may not have an exact idea, in which case it is your job to try to figure out the best way forward. So there is certainly some flexibility, and I would say it's encouraged to explore the different ways that this can be done in the best way. So you do have a bit of flexibility on that front, but at the end of the day, you do have to answer to a certain imperative here, which is either what the government is seeking to do. And so that's the answer from the public side of things. From private, I will let private consultants answer when they have their own becoming series. But I will say that you do respond, of course, to the projects that are available to an extent, but you can always choose to a certain level what it is that you're willing to work on or not, and that's a bit of a value decision. But I will say in general, you work on the projects of the day as much as possible, of course.
Yeah, I think in a lot of roles we find we don't always get to choose the problems that we're facing, but we do have the flexibility in how we solve them or how we find the answers. So that definitely checks out. So we have a question here from Grace. What quantitative skills would you recommend improving for someone with strong qualitative skills? So are there any programming language or data visualization tools in particular that you recommend?
Right. So if we're talking about policy and programs, I will say in general, so much of it comes down to, at least in where I'm sitting. I will say programming is not critical in the policy side of things. There are programmers that work in this particular field for sure, but I will say that in general, it's more math skills. So it's more the math and engineering skills to have a certain sense of, what is energy, how do you save energy, and what are the methodologies to calculate energy savings and things like that. So there's a bit more like quantitative skills on that side of things. What I really mean more broadly is, yes, I think data visualization is really a great skill to acquire. Spreadsheets and macros and all the work that goes behind that is a great skill to acquire. And the general engineering, and I don't mean complicated engineering, I mean the basics of energy and power and energy savings, and how does that translate to greenhouse gas emission reduction, for instance. Just getting a general sense of all the different aspects. But I will say that on the policy side of things, having a really good sense of the ecosystem, the qualitative policy ecosystem is just as critical.
Awesome. Yeah, I think as a student, it's always tough to figure out where you should be putting your time and which skills to focus on. So it's great to have that input. So we have a question from Danvir, which said, so you mentioned about internships, but what about someone who's a graduate who maybe doesn't have access to those internship opportunities? How should they approach it?
Yeah. So this is a great question. So I can only speak for myself. So I was fortunate enough to have internships that definitely helped, but I have seen a lot of people who did not have internships and who did very well as well. And I think that the difference is there's a lot of work in applying to a lot of different jobs. So I will say that as much as possible, if you can get involved in anything that's not a particular job. So if you're involved on the side in volunteer work, if you're involved on the side in your own personal initiatives, if you're involved in an organization that's not exactly related in this particular work, but that has transferable skills, all those experiences are valuable and will be valued by an employer. I will say that you will have to apply, of course, quite a bit to a lot of positions to get in. You may not have the network that others have, but honestly, I've seen so many people who got in this field through working in a completely different other area, or the most memorable aspect of their particular background was something that they did on the side through a volunteer group. That I think it's any kind of experience you can get to show your enthusiasm is really key. One last aspect I will mention is a lot of organizations wish to hire and then train, to a certain extent. Ideally, you have someone who can hit the ground running, but at the same time, you do want someone whom you can mold to a certain extent. So the abilities and the skills and having demonstrated that interest will work as well. If you're interested in, I will say on the public side of things, you don't have to be in a co-op program or a university to get a contract or an internship or a short-term employment. There are plenty of positions in that respect. In the private sector, I've seen plenty of people having internships as well without being exactly in a particular program. But I will say in general, just try to get as much as you can through your own for your own initiatives on the side.
Yeah, I know with my role now, a lot of what landed me this role was my volunteer experience. So that makes a lot of sense. So we probably have time for one or two more questions. I'm going to go to one of the questions that was pre-submitted by the audience. So what personality traits do you think that a policy analyst should have, and or what type of person do you think would enjoy this role?
Right. That's a really good question. And I've reflected a lot on that myself as I, given my transitions and what I like, what I don't like. I'm learning more. I would say the last year or two, I've really started to learn more. What is it that I'm good at, and what do I enjoy, and what would make sense for my, my next move, for instance. And what I've seen. So as I mentioned earlier, if you're the kind of person who likes to work with your hands and to work outdoors and to be constantly, physically moving, maybe not the ideal position. But if you're in the context of office jobs, usually the people who enjoy this work are people who want to make a difference on a relatively large scale. So you're not necessarily working on a very, very small problem. You're working on a really big problem and all the different elements of that. So you have to be interested in those kinds of big problems. And that's not always the case for everybody. Some people want a project that's a bit more bite-sized. These are big questions. I will say you have to be someone who enjoys reading and writing. You have to be someone who enjoys presenting and helping strategize. So I think those are the kinds of interests that make sense. So the kinds of people that I've seen really enjoy their work typically come from that variety of background, but all have those kinds of elements in common.
So there are a lot of really great questions that are asking a bit more about the technical side of energy efficiency in general and asking some questions about policy. And so for those questions, I would just recommend that you reach out to Jérôme after through email. I'm sure he'd be happy to get into some of that with you. They're really great questions. Just we're focusing on the career side of things a bit today. So for our last question, it's from Farseed. So Jérôme, what sort of policy research topics do you think need to be explored? And they're specifically asking in regards to, what kind of topics can be explored to push energy efficiency programming forward in provincial and federal government.
Yeah, this is a big question and a great question, and there's a lot of areas. I'll mention a few. So if we want to achieve a lot of our goals, so we're talking about achieving net zero emissions by 2050. If we're talking about creating good, solid jobs across the country, if we're talking about economic stimulus and all those things, we need to work on buildings across the country, our homes and buildings across the country. And the scale of the problem is enormous. And what that means is we need people to do those things. So one area is how do we get people like you, people who are coming out of university, but also people who are retraining or trying to move sectors. How are we getting people to have the skills to build to the efficiency level and to retrofit to the efficiency level that we need to achieve those goals? So this whole workforce development, this is a social science question, really, in many ways, economic question. How do we get the labor and the skills to solve that problem? So that's one of the big problems we have. The second problem I would draw your attention to is in, I would say, financing and capital. So we want to solve this problem on the scale that is needed. Public money is just one small element. We need we need markets behind this, and we need to figure out how to get private investors to invest in a building retrofit, because it is profitable for them, it is profitable or it is a win-win situation for all involved. But how do we get this to happen on a large scale? So how did we get people to have access to home ownership? We worked really hard on getting mortgages standardized and all those kinds of things. How do we do this for energy efficiency? How do we get private capital involved in this at scale so that anybody can and will make their home and their building more efficient? So that's the second area, finance, I would say. Third area is about what we call embodied carbon. So all the carbon that is in your building materials, that is in all the in the supply chain, upstream. So we talk about the emissions from your buildings, from your house, but there's also emissions in producing the materials, producing all the elements that go into building that element, that house and that building. And we need to figure out how to clean that up as well. And we need to figure out how much there is, where it is, and what's the best way to target those emissions as well, because it is a huge aspect to the question in general. There are so many more. There's so many more questions to all of this, but those are the first three that came to mind.
Yeah, I gave you a really big question for the last one, so thank you. So we're right at 5:45. We're actually 1 minute over, so I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you, everybody, for coming to our first Becoming series, and thank you so much, Jérôme, for an amazing presentation and for great answers to some tough questions and really interesting questions. If you're looking to start doing some of that learning around energy efficiency, check out efficiencycanada.org. We're the national think tank for energy efficiency, so lots of resources there. Also, reach out to Jérôme if you have questions that didn't get answered. And just some other events coming up. Each Friday, we do our Discover EE series, and that's Friday at noon Eastern Time. This week's topic is retrofits, not if, but how. And we also do an Advocacy EE series, which is a great way to start building some of those qualitative skills that we talked about. On September 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to learn about how to build effective coalitions. So thank you, everybody. And if you missed anything, the recording will be online. Thanks for coming.